To go live, and we are live. This Hangout on Air is live. Hello, everybody. This is OOTLE15 Biblical Scholars Hangout on Air. My name is Brooke Lester, and with me today is Sarah Koenig. And Sarah is Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, Washington. She's the author of Isn't This Bathsheba? A Study in Characterization. I'm Brooke Lester, and I am assistant professor of Hebrew Scriptures at Garrett Evangelical Theological Seminary in Evanston, Illinois. Hi, Sarah.
Hi, Brooke.
Hey. And again, this is in service of the Open Old Testament Learning Event 2015, OOTLE15, taking place in spring of 2015. You can find that course at OOTLE15.net. And today we are talking about, or where the course is, Jeremiah and the last days of Jerusalem. And this is one of those parts where I have to say, because of some choices I make about how I teach my course, my students are having actually their first of two runs at this time period, because we haven't done the former prophets yet in this course. That is, for my students, they have not yet done Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings. So we're working through the latter prophets, 8th century prophets, 7th century prophets, then the exilic and post-exilic prophets, before kind of running back to the starting line on that stuff and going through it on the former prophets. So it makes me a little confused about, I guess you could say it gives us a certain freedom about what to pay attention to, because Jeremiah only makes sense in his time, and my students are only just beginning to explore that time, and any viewers may not know anything at all about that time. So maybe that works out. Maybe that works out very well. I was coming clean with you, Sarah, before we started, how much thinking I've been doing this week about Jeremiah, and more specifically, why I don't care about Jeremiah historically. You know, we all have these things that we care about and don't care about in our courses, and we've talked about those. Some of those as we've been going through this material. I love the Psalms. Some of the others weren't crazy about the Psalms, and I've had to put some thought into how I'm not crazy about Jeremiah. But you, Sarah, were saying that you like Jeremiah. Were you saying that earlier when we talked earlier?
I do. I'm a big fan of Jeremiah, and when I do my survey course, it's the entire Bible for the undergrads, it's an entire Bible in a quarter. So it's covering everything, Old Testament, New Testament, in 10 weeks. So because of that, there's a lot that gets left out. And in the one-day class on the prophets, I covered Jeremiah. I feel like I could do Jeremiah as my example of a prophet and really get a lot of the aspects of what makes prophets unique and who they are through this one single lens. But I do something similar to what you do, Brooke. I suppose we talk about the monarchy going up through Solomon, and then we jump to Jeremiah, and then we go to exile. And so there's a bit of that historical whiplash, I think, the students experience as well. But I think there's something about that, too, that can be helpful in some ways. But I like Jeremiah because I think you have so much of, again, what makes a prophet unique, his call narrative is unique, being chosen by God for this job, and he doesn't want it. And that relates to the second thing that I like about Jeremiah, and probably it's the thing I like the best, is his incredible, brutal honesty with God and to God. And I think that's a really important thing to notice. It runs throughout the Old Testament. You guys talked about this with the Psalms of Lament, for example. But Jeremiah is another great example of how just raw and complaining people can be to God. So I'll stop there.
Oh yeah, and I had to think about that because
Did I make it?
Try muting and let's see if that clears it up a little bit.
Okay.
Okay, that'll work for the moment.
Good.
So you're unmuted now, right?
Am I muted or am I unmuted?
Sounds like you're not muted. Can you mute your microphone and we'll see if that clears up for a second?
I might not be able to mute.
Let me see. I can do it for you, actually. I have the power.
Oh.
There, you're muted. I silence you, Sarah. Okay, which we okay. So I'm actually gonna just take one quick look at volume in the control room. Okay, we'll see how that plays out. Sarah, what you made me think was when you talked about Jeremiah's, brutal honesty with God. I was one of the things I had to think about this week is that I said earlier in our series how much I like the complaint psalms. And I do. They're some of my favorite things is these complaint psalms. So somebody who likes the complaint psalms really probably ought to like Jeremiah more than I do, because Jeremiah, he's the weeping prophet. He's the one doing all these complaint psalms. And I do love that about Jeremiah. I like the way that Jeremiah holds God accountable for what Jeremiah perceives as God's dishonesty in preparing Jeremiah for what he's going to be facing, for giving Jeremiah a message. Sort of I guess it's like the Cassandra complex, isn't it? Right? I never thought about that with Jeremiah, but doomed to know the future and not to be believed. Right, is the Cassandra complex, and there's Jeremiah, who is convinced, turns out rightly, that he has a readier bead on events than do his opponents, who believe in the inviolability of Jerusalem. His opponents who believe that because God's temple resides in Jerusalem, that they need not fear the Babylonians. Against them, Jeremiah is convinced otherwise, that Jerusalem will fall to the Babylonians, and does not find acceptance. And so his honesty with God about his anger about that, I find very compelling and very interesting, which is great. Part of me is sort of like, yeah, but I already have complaint psalms. Like, I don't need Jeremiah's complaint psalms. There's already like a whole book, full of, it's like 40% complaint psalms. But the more, it's funny, Sarah, because the more I thought about it, the more I realized that my distaste or my lack of interest has less to do with Jeremiah himself, and for me, more to do with fandom of Jeremiah. And what I mean by that is folks who, if you're going to love Jeremiah, and we talk about this, like Jeremiah is among the prophets whose prophecies are vindicated by events, right? And we talk about there's part of why these are preserved, right? Is in the time of Hosea and Amos, there were certainly prophets who were prophesying that Samaria would not fall to the Assyrians, but it did. And so those prophets are not vindicated by events, and their words are not, for the most part, preserved, and except possibly as sort of the rhetoric of their detractors or opponents. And Amos and Hosea are vindicated by events, and so their material is preserved. And Jeremiah sits like that, right? His words are preserved in part because he turned out to be right. But I guess what bothers me is what he's, and that's part of what people get excited about is there's sort of that that cheerleading that we do for the prophets. It's like, oh, Jeremiah, hang in there, man. People aren't listening to you, but you're going to be vindicated by events. You're right, man. And so hang in there. But of course, what is Jeremiah right about? Jeremiah, where he and his opponents agree, is that God brings nations against guilty Israel in order that those nations might kill and rape and plunder and deport. Like there, Jeremiah and his opponents are in complete agreement. Jeremiah's opponents are looking at history and saying Assyria fell to the, Samaria fell to the Assyrians, but not Jerusalem. Jerusalem didn't fall in Hezekiah's day when Sennacherib came. So this shows us that God is going to spare Jerusalem, and they've got pretty good evidence. Jeremiah has his own evidence. Again, see above. God does bring nations. God does bring nations against guilty Israel to kill and rape and plunder and deport. And so I guess part of what bothers me is what he's right about. in that sense, or the idea that that's something that he's right about. Does that make sense, Sarah? You know? Oh, I unmuted you, but I think you're still muted yourself. Try now. Nothing. Oh no, wait, let me volume you up. Try now.
Okay,
All
better?
right, there we go. Yeah.
Okay. And for the record, Brooke is not in the habit of silencing women at all.
What our
So, for
viewers
the
won't
record.
know, and that Sarah and I both know. Do you remember that story, Sarah? We won't name names, but do you remember that story out of the PTS PhD suite?
No, I forgot it.
There was a okay sidebar. Um, when Sarah and I were teaching fellows together at Princeton Theological Seminary, we would go off and we would teach what were called our precepts. You know, once a week we would have a series of classes with small groups of students of 12 or 14 students, and it was part of us learning to sort of be teachers and not just be teaching assistants who make photocopies and do some grading and stuff. And we would come back to the PhD suite and we would debrief regularly about how it was going in class and everything. And then one student came back one time with us. We were talking about students who dominate the discussion. And this student had this teaching fellow, one of our peers, had a student, happened to be a woman in this instance, who was dominating the discussion and sort of refusing to give time over to her peers and sort of filibustering. And as this peer, as this teaching fellow described it, he said, well, I took care of it. I held out my hand like this to her, and I said, I silence you. And we were like, no, 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 you can't. That's not how it works. You can't do that. So that's what I thought of when I said I silence you, Sarah. So no, but does that make sense about the little bit of certain kind of a squeamishness I have about what Jeremiah is right about?
Well, let me check. So you're specifically frustrated that he's right that Jerusalem gets destroyed? Do you want Jerusalem to be inviolable, or are you okay with that?
Am I one of Jeremiah's the other group of Deuteronomists, one of his detractors?
Right.
No, it's not that. For me, it's what bothers me is the idea of contemporary Christians, right? Especially, or I think it would bother me um, from Jews or other, but I'm just going to worry about Christians today because these are my people,
Mm-hmm.
who are excited about Jeremiah's rightness and inclined towards a certain glibness about the fall of Jerusalem to the Babylonians on that account. That is, well, if you don't want to be, killed, raped, plundered, and deported, I guess you shouldn't spread your hands to false gods.
Yeah.
That's sort of the flip side of cheerleading Jeremiah's rightness. It seems
Right.
to me that's like the seamy underbelly of cheerleading Jeremiah's rightness.
Well, and that makes me think about Amos, because I think it's always so easy to point fingers and realize that the message then really is pointed against you. So you shouldn't be glib about it because you'll be judged by that same manner. Yeah, that's a really interesting response where we sort of we hold the prophets out, Jeremiah out at arm's length and say, oh, let's, those bad Israelites, they spread their hands to false gods, and yet not aware that the message is more than just the other group.
Mm-hmm.
So I get that. I was going to add too to your conversation about the Cassandra. There's a term Jeremiah, right? So he's got his own adjective as well. So
what is a Jeremiah? Is it just a screed, or is it more complicated than that?
I think I think it's more of the negative message, but let me see. Jeremiah. Um, it's a long, mournful complaint or lamentation, a list of woes, which always contains a prophecy of a society's imminent downfall.
Okay.
So there you go.
One thing that I as far as teaching opportunities go, and this really comes out of the instructors who formed me as a master's student, and it was something I really appreciated, is I liked the way that they would play sort of follow the logic. Is my volume okay, Sarah? Because I realized
Yeah.
that. Okay.
No, it's good.
Okay. where, so for instance, if I'm a reader who finds myself cheerleading Jeremiah and sort of brought up short on this question of, well, then, you know, what does that indicate about your belief? They were very good about talking about our theologies as something that is not. We don't have theologies that are, you know, like if you're a Methodist, that doesn't mean that like you have like a Methodist theology, and then whenever you encounter questions or biblical text, you theologize on this top-down basis, but rather that we have a bunch of unconnected, different opinions, ideas, valuations, and convictions about things. And what these amount to is really usually a very lopsided, mutually inconsistent, kind of overall incoherent theology. And we can attempt to begin to bring order out of it, but I think that the most that a sort of overarching theology can do is to call our attention to where we sort of have these inconsistencies or problems in our theologies. And so I think, you know, what I would imagine them to be saying is, what do I think, what beliefs that I have about God are made evident by my cheerleading of Jeremiah and with regard to God bringing nations against guilty Israelites to kill, rape, plunder, and deport. So do I think that that's how God behaves today? Like, does God bring, you know, Germans against Paris? Does God bring, where I see genocide in the world? Do I see God's hand at work in bringing murderers against the guilty? And some do, right? Katrina, in New Orleans, but they're a minority, aren't they? I mean, there's a very small number of voices among the Christian theologies that see the hand of God in the flooding of an American city. And so then what does that mean? Does that mean, well, God used to be like that, but God isn't like that anymore? Really? Then where did God change? Or is God like that with Israelites, but not with Christians? Is God like where? And then following that, sort of following that thread and see where it goes, because it's going to run you into some hard questions. For a lot of Christians, I think there's sort of God was like that before Jesus and not after. Okay, so Jesus came to save us from God, right? Or Jesus came to change God from a genocidal, force to something. Like, what exactly is going on there, If I taught theology, I think that would be a great way on Sundays to sort of get ramped up on some questions. Does that make sense?
Totally. One of my favorite descriptions comes from a colleague who says that a lot of people have this idea that Jesus becomes God's anger management program. That, beforehand, God is still angry and has problems controlling his anger. And so thank goodness for Jesus, who helps God control his anger, and then everything changes, which I always find sort of funny. But it's true. I mean, the implications of what we think and how we can spin that out into what we would say today. I think that's a great way to study these things. But then I also think your question is so fascinating. What is our reaction to these texts or to these authors telling us about what do we think about God or the way the world works? And so how does it confront us and say, maybe you need to think about this or come to an accounting of what you think? I feel like there was something else about Jeremiah I wanted to say in what you had mentioned. And yeah, I mean, you described Jeremiah as the weeping prophet. It's not like Jeremiah himself has that sense of glee at Jerusalem being destroyed. And so you've got that in chapter 8, where you go back and forth between is it God who's weeping or is it Jeremiah who's weeping? And then you've got all the poetry, too, where Jeremiah says, I wish that my head was a fountain, that I could just have continual tears for the sake of the people. Well, or is it Jeremiah or is it God who's saying that? So I appreciate all the poetry and metaphors that we get in Jeremiah, but also that sense of Jeremiah, doesn't seem to enjoy that he's right, And so the fans who do are really missing the point of the book, it seems to me.
It is true. I mean, you. I mean that. Was it Nisha or someone else that was saying last week? What were we talking? We were talking last week about the 8th century prophets. No, it was possibly it was either John Miller or Dave Garber talking about how important it was to read slowly. You know that the way to read the prophets is not simply to read about the prophets, and it's not simply to skim the prophets. Right? We're not. Then there's a way that there's so many different ways to read. And I think, go back to everything we've ever said in this series about how important a good liberal arts background is for a biblical studies course. When students come in who do not have a background in Bible, but they have a lifelong habit of being really engaged by narrative fiction or poetry, I don't worry about those students. They'll pick up the biblical studies part, but they've got what's needed already because they know how to read different ways. And reading Jeremiah slowly, so that I can, when the well-known, inveighing against those who say peace, peace, but there is no peace. Those who say shalom, shalom, but there is no well-being. There is no shalom. Is so powerful. Yeah, I mean, it's almost trite to say, oh my gosh, it's so powerful, but it is powerful, and it's powerful in part when we slow down and allow those words to work on us, and ask ourselves, who are those who say peace, peace, but there is no peace? Where do I say peace, peace, but there is no peace? And it can be matters as small as, in our higher education context, who are those that look around and say, who are the tenured and the tenure track that are looking around and saying, oh, things are fine, when things are not fine, for the army of marginalized adjunct and other part-time instructors that are out there. And that is one, it's an obvious example in our context, but pick it, it doesn't have to be the big global things. And I think sometimes when we're reading the prophets, because they're engaging matters that are so big, when we look for the meaning, how might Jeremiah be speaking in our time? It's natural for us to look for global-sized or nation-sized issues around which people are, for instance, saying peace, peace, but there is no peace, and maybe not so much the neighborhood book club, or something like that. Oh, wait, I unsilenced you, Sarah. Wait, now we're playing dueling mutes. Wait.
I know.
Okay, there you go.
Yeah, I think there's something about that. That's a great point. It doesn't have to be about the huge things as well. And that also makes me think of another prophet, Zechariah, who talks about don't despising the day of the small things. And there's something about that message in the prophets of like, look around and pay attention and see what's in your context and your situation. But then the other thing that struck me as sort of ironic as you're talking about how important it is to read slowly, is I wonder if if I'm always working against that by assigning my students so much reading that I'm not really allowing them to just read over a chapter. What if I, instead of giving them 25 chapters to read, what if I just gave them one and said, read this really slowly and read it over and over again and meditate on it? So I suppose it's not just students' fault, it's also partly my responsibility for not teaching that as well as I could.
Do you also go back and forth on that, where just in your teaching, I'm looking at my own course that I'm teaching now, and I'm giving the students a choice of writing projects each week, and 2 or 3 to choose from. Sometimes students will email me and suggest a third or a fourth of their own their own idea and say, is there a way to make this work instead? And there was a point at which I was considering or listing ideas of short, close readings for the makes, and I found myself not doing that much, or maybe at all. And maybe I want to really be sure to get some of those in the second half of the course. But this is a cycle, and I've had iterations of this course where I've had students do more close readings of short text, and I have to ask myself why I keep drifting away from it. And I wonder if it's in part because when I look at the sort of what Wiggins and McTighe and the Understanding by Design people call the big ideas and essential questions that I'm hoping for my learners to engage, either it's easier for them to engage those big ideas and essential questions looking at the sort of larger topics, or I'm simply in the habit of finding opportunity in those larger topics for my students to engage these big ideas and essential questions, and I simply lack my own history of success in finding opportunities for students to engage those big ideas and essential questions in these close readings, of short texts. My colleague Julie Duncan, by contrast, I've seen the way that she teaches, and I've seen her syllabus, and I've visited while she teaches, and it's almost all close readings of short texts. Like whereas I've got my students sort of strip mining the surface of the latter prophets, strip mining the surface of the former prophets, and so on. She just takes them out into the Alaskan wilderness or wherever and just drills way down deep in one spot. Or I guess you could think of it as taking an ice core from the Arctic or something. It's just, they're not messing up a lot of acreage, but they're drilling down really deeply.
Yeah, and it's a great question. I think that both ways work for different reasons. And in my survey classes, I've been in the habit of just doing the strip mining, so we only go about this deep, but we've got a lot of width. And partly I just want to have the sense of the whole of the text and kind of allow that to wash over the students as well. I read a quote from, I think it was from Chris Seitz a long time ago, and he said, the problem with these introductory classes, well, he said specifically the problem with Old Testament introduction classes is they often threaten to become Old Testament conclusions. And that has sort of...
Threaten to become what?
Old Testament conclusions. And so I'm thinking that I'm introducing this stuff, and realistically, maybe, 70% of my students are never, ever going to take another Old Testament class again. And so I feel like I want them to get a sense of the whole in that class. And yet I suppose there's a sense that if it is all about the strip mining, there's never the sense to go deep and get the core and see kind of the essence or drill down on something, then that also could be a conclusion of itself. You can sort of conclude, I don't know, do you conclude surface things if you only study in the surface way? And maybe that's a more philosophical question. But it's a great question to say, which maybe what you're saying is do both, get a sense of the whole. Because I think I want things to sort of wash over people and feel like you can't just read a chapter of Lord of the Rings to really get a sense of it. Or maybe to pull on a different analogy that one of your students has talked about. Maybe if you only watch one episode of How I Met Your Mother, you don't really get a sense of the whole of the show. You need to watch the whole thing, the whole season, to really get a sense of who these characters are and what they're about.
No, that's true, because sometimes there'll be either a running joke in a show like How I Met Your Mother. There's a running theme. There's certain aspects of sort of not character development, but character traits, persistent character traits that if you like, so suit up, right? So if Barney, when Barney Stimson says, to suit up, that might only happen once in an episode, and if you haven't read through, the long series, all the chapters, that's not going to mean anything to you in terms of what's happening in that scene. So that would be an example of where sort of helicoptering in to drill deeply, there's some things going on there that you're simply not going to be able to hear no matter how hard you listen, because you haven't seen the surface. You haven't gotten the lay of the land. in that respect. You're going to miss what's happening at the drilling deep level if you haven't gotten some sense of the lay of the land.
Yeah, and that's another great way to say it. And I think for Jeremiah, to return back to that topic, I think in your question, didn't you say, is Jeremiah a prophet of doom or prophet of hope? And you've got to read the whole thing before you can answer that more glibly. To say, well, yeah, there's a couple chapters in there where you've got some good hope, but at the same time, there's a lot of hardship. And so if we just say, well, doom and hope together, we're kind of missing that there's a lot more of passion and tears and frustration and anger and hurt than there is just, well, it all balances out in the end and it's exactly equal.
The prophet and hope, the prophet and doom thing, that does really jazz me up about Jeremiah, and mainly because it provides an opportunity. There you go, kitty, kitty. It provides an opportunity to go at a question that I always want to go at some point in an introduction to Hebrew Bible or Old Testament class, but which I also sort of go at only with great fear and trembling. And you'll understand, it's the question of, is the gospel in the Hebrew Bible? And if so, how is the gospel in the Hebrew Bible? And this is obviously, now at this point, this will be helpful, I think, for learners to hear this. Like, you should hear me and Sarah, and maybe we do this, we do this without sort of signposting it, and I think that can be confusing, as we skip back and forth between biblical studies as an academic discipline that goes at text, that tries to understand texts better by asking historical questions, literary questions, and cultural questions, right? And in principle, biblical studies is a conversation that every reader can share in, regardless of one's faith commitments. You do not have to be a Jew or a Christian or a theist or of any particular or any faith commitments at all in order to do what biblical studies does with biblical texts, because what it does is analogous with what a Shakespeare scholar does with Shakespeare texts, or a Chaucer study does with Chaucer student does with Chaucer texts. At the same time, because biblical studies tends to be a discipline carried out by Christians for Christians, although not always, and for Hebrew Bible studies, Jews and Christians among Jews and Christians, although not exclusively. I mean, there's brilliant biblical scholars who are overt about their agnosticism or their atheism or that are Muslim. There's Jewish scholars who produce Amy Jill Levine and Mark Zvi Bretler, who do the annotated Jewish New Testament. I might have gotten the title in the wrong order, but right. But that all said, there's a tendency to go into that in-house conversation, and you can hear, right? People can hear, Sarah, you and I doing that as we raise questions about readers of faith, and maybe my concerns about readers of faith who are cheerleading genocide, and because Jeremiah was right, or and so on and so on, and what kind of theologies they develop. And at that point, we've really moved over from academic biblical studies as a historical, literary, and cultural discipline to Christian biblical theology, I guess you could say. That is the theological musings, ruminations, and conversations among people who share certain faith convictions, right? It could be a group of Methodists having a conversation that presupposes Wesleyan theology. It could be a group of Christians who just sort of presuppose something Christ is Lord or important or whatever, the convictions are around there, that they share, or so. But these people who have a shared platform that is going to include them and leave other people out of the conversation, which is fine, right? There's not that there's anything wrong with that. So maybe I should be clearer about signposting when we do this, because learning that distinction is one of the things that introductory Hebrew Bible students are learning to do, right? Is to be able to switch gears and to know when we're switching gears, because we're moving from a game that is being played by a certain body of participants according to a certain number of rules to a game that's being played by a more limited set of participants with a different set of rules. This was a huge digression on my way towards talking about Jeremiah as a prophet of both doom and hope. But Sarah, what do you think about that? I mean, that's something that you encounter in your it's something we all encounter in our teaching, right?
Yeah.
What do you?
And you're right. I suppose, we're sort of with feet in both worlds, and maybe we don't always signal when we're hopping, or maybe it's not even a hop. Maybe it's something as subtle as shifting our weight from one foot to the other. Like, okay, now I'm talking in this way, and now I'm talking the other. And it might be more helpful to students if it is more clear of the, now I'm talking about this world, and I'm talking about this world. There's my 5-year-old who's going to go have breakfast. So I think that's a good point to say that maybe if we signposted better. But I'm intrigued by your question, because a question like the gospel in the Old Testament or the gospel in Jeremiah, how would you answer that? How would you kind of signpost that for your students?
Answering that while I realized that I'd had my Twitter feed open to, this is the morning of tech, this is why we don't do this kind of thing early in the morning. I'd had my Twitter feed set to my own notifications and not to the OOTLE15 feed. By the way, those of you who are watching who are not part of the course, there's a Twitter stream going on this, hashtag OOTLE15, OOTLE15, that I mean to be watching and taking questions as we go. So I'm skimming that now and saying, wow, you guys are, I thought no one was engaged this morning because I was only looking at my own notifications, but now I'm looking at the Twitter feed, I'm like, wow, they're on fire this morning, everybody's awake. But I don't think, yes, Tanya, you did hear me say kitty cat. I've got animals dueling for my affection while we're doing this morning, because we're both working from home. And Sarah also has animals vying for her affection, but they're the Homo sapiens variety, I think. But the gospel, so the question that was raised by some of those who formed me as a master's student, and this was at Christian Theological Seminary in Indianapolis, mainly Ron Allen, who taught New Testament and teaches New Testament, and Charles Allen, no relation to Ron, who teaches theology there. And they encouraged us to look at the gospel, especially looking at some New Testament texts where, Jesus comes proclaiming the gospel in Mark, while at the same time keeping his messianic secret about who he is. And there's a number of, they're showing us how many different ways the gospel is talked about in the New Testament, and that it is facile to simply say that the gospel is, oh, the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus, or that Jesus was born and, suffered and died and was raised on the third day. That, like, that's not the gospel Jesus was proclaiming, and he appears to have been an authority on his gospel, so it's clearly more complicated than that. And of course, there's a good deal said about the good news of different kinds in the Hebrew Bible, right? How beautiful the feet on the mountains of the one who comes bearing good news, and so on. And they encouraged us to take as a starting template, because it was one that they were working through, was something like, God loves people, and then build on that. God loves which people? All people? God loves all people. How? Unconditionally. Unconditionally would tend to come in. God loves people. God loves people unconditionally. God loves all people unconditionally. God, and so on. And on the other hand, God demands that people embody God's love for others and for the whole world. So the basic two sides here being that God invites us to something, to relationship, to love, to unconditional love, to unconditional relationship, and at the same time, God does make demands. God wants something from you. You have obligations here, which for anyone who's reading about Jeremiah and the Deuteronomists, especially during this time, right? A big part of this disagreement between two schools of Deuteronomists, right? Those who believe in the inviolability of Jerusalem and those who don't believe in the inviolability of Jerusalem, where One group is really taking the Davidic covenant as its central flag, as its standard, saying God says in 2 Samuel 7, in some of the Psalms like 2, and you get the God has, unlike God's covenant with Saul, which was broken when Saul did things God said not to do or didn't like. God's covenant with David is forever. God's covenant with David will never expire. It can never be broken. Even David and his kin do not have the power to break this covenant. They can violate its stipulations, and they will be punished. But there will always be a Davidic king. There will always be one in the line of David. Hence the inviolability of Jerusalem. Whereas the Jeremiah crowd are saying, yeah, but there's also the Mosaic covenant. There's also the covenant made with Moses on Sinai, which is conditional in many, which has much more conditional language around it, and hence the potential violability of Jerusalem. That yes, punishment can go that far, because of the very strict stipulations that are put on the people, and that the people willingly undergo in the Mosaic covenant. And so this idea of looking for the gospel in the Hebrew Bible, sort of readily renders over these two icons of the two flip sides of the gospel, that understood this way, in these two covenants. And then you can start with, so then in Jeremiah you can see it so neatly compressed and compact, because there are points at which Jeremiah sounds very much like a prophet of doom, right? In that Mosaic covenant way, and other parts where he sounds like one of his own, the people where he agrees with his opponents, that there will always be restoration. That God, even where the people Israel, even where the people of God just break the stipulations of the covenant, bam, 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 right down the line, they're not capable of breaking the covenant. They don't have that power. Only God could break the covenant, and God never will. So that's kind of part of what gets me excited about about Jeremiah as a small example of something that exists in larger form throughout the Hebrew Bible, as the possibility for bringing in the language of the gospel in the Hebrew Bible. And how does one look for the gospel in the Hebrew Bible as a Christian, as a person of Christian faith, as a person who sees oneself in covenant in that way, without it having to be sort of that thing where I feel like texts get sort of railroaded over, in terms of, well, Jesus is the fourth person in the furnace in Daniel, no matter what the original author meant. And Jesus is the person that Jacob wrestles with at the Jabbok, no matter what the original author meant. And that way that we can kind of railroad over the texts by imposing, in an effort to find the gospel in the Old Testament, in trying to make the Old Testament relevant to Christians, simply populating it with Jesus at every point, which is a very sort of imposed top-down, as opposed to the language of the gospel as God's invitation and God's unconditional invitation and God's ineluctable demand, as a way of listening harder to the Hebrew Bible and listening harder for what's going on in terms of unconditionality and conditionality in the Hebrew Bible, rather than sticking something on it. Wow, that went on for a while. That was more than I thought I was going to say. I don't know. What do you think about that, Sarah?
I was going to ask, did you talk yourself into being more excited about Jeremiah?
God, I'm so excited about Jeremiah. Jeremiah's the best.
Well,
what's not to love?
Because it is this very compact, I love the way you're describing it, as you've got both of those pieces in it. The unconditional love. And one of the things I like I like it, and it's hard, in chapter 31, where you've got the hope chapter, in Jeremiah, is that God is the one who both wounds and will heal. And so it's not up to, well, okay, if the Israelites just sort of shape up, then God's going to restore them. It's all God's work. And so I appreciate that piece of it, that it's about who God is and what God is going to do with and for God's people. And so I think that's a great thing. One of the but then you're right. Jeremiah is also pushing against his colleagues who are like, oh, we don't have to worry at all because of this unconditional. Here's my little friend here. The unconditional piece of the unconditional piece that it's not just, well, we can do whatever we want because God promised that Jerusalem will be safe. And he's reminding them about, remember what happened at Shiloh, remember the things that happened before. So you do have a lot compressed in that book. So there's a great piece to that. I feel like the other thing I was going to say that I like about Jeremiah is I just like how big and how messy God is in Jeremiah, where you do have that, within a couple verses, I hurt and I will heal. And you've got similar things with the other prophets. I think you've got that in Isaiah as well. But at the same time, because I just spent a day on Jeremiah as an example of all the prophets, I often talk to my students about how there's this kind of cognitive dissonance, and what is your picture of God? Is your picture of God too small? Is your picture of God only the one half of, Brooke, what you were describing about theology or gospel? Is it only God unconditionally loves, or is it only God makes all these demands? And so how can you hold those together? And I love how Jeremiah introduces that. And he also says it's not easy because he has a hard experience. And so I think the thing that I like is Jeremiah's reminder to people of faith is that it can be a hard life, and it's not a guarantee that all is going to go smoothly or well. In fact, sometimes quite the opposite.
Especially because I love the way that when you say that it's hard, and Jeremiah shows that it's hard, and a part of what makes it hard is that Jeremiah and his opponents very earnestly they're constructing Yahwism before our eyes. And I point that out because, as we know, the final form of the Hebrew Bible is working very hard, especially Deuteronomism. Deuteronomism, and my students, you'll hear more about this when we really go through the former prophets after we're done with the latter prophets. But Deuteronomism is trying to present itself, as do all reform movements. The Protestant Reformation did the same. This is the nature of reform movements, is to present themselves as going back to the original pure form of something. Right? They're once upon a time Moses gave us the perfect, exact, distilled, 9944, 100% pure Yahwism, and we've fallen away from it, and we need to return to it. And as with all reform movements, that claim tends not to bear up well under too much historical scrutiny. So, for example, my students are reading Christopher Rolston on the emergence of monotheism in Israel, and showing how the same texts that insist that Moses gave us a pure monotheism that we've just sort of deviated from, over and over, show that, those same texts show us how polytheistic Israelite religion was in its origins, that it developed as a polytheistic devotion to Yahweh among the polytheistic devotions to Baal and to El and to other gods, and became something else, became monotheistic over time. And the reason that that's important to me is that we ourselves need to be constructing our faith. And see, I'm skipping right here. I am going over to the in-house, Christian theological conversation. But this holds true for any person of any faith, I think, and perhaps could be argued even. We all have to construct our worldview. We have to construct our convictions. We have to construct our what we think Christianity is. And there's Jeremiah and his friends. After the Assyrians have pulled out, because they're busy with the Babylonians, they're able to remove the standards and signs of Assyrian religious practice from the temple and from the shrines, and then they have to ask themselves what actually belongs here, and making decisions like, okay, Asherah poles have to go. When in fact those were not some new thing. Those were, Isaiah loved, standing stones, but apparently it's time for those to go. And this difficulty that recognizing that what we're doing, any appeals to an original pure, we're all going to be dueling with our respective appeals to an original purity that only we can see. But what in fact we're doing is we're hashing these things out in real time in community, and it's important for us to see that in these texts as much as we see it in our own lives.
Yeah, and that's another great example of how this is so real and so applicable to people. And I keep thinking about how lucky your students are, that how lucky people are to say, look, here's this professor who's saying, think critically about what you're constructing and the implications of it. So that's great. And the other thing that makes me think about a little bit is the Wesleyan quadrilateral, when it talks about how we think about things of faith based on scripture, but then, so we'll kind of wrap that out, but reason and tradition and experience. So Jeremiah and his friends have this experience of God, and so that makes them have to construct their reality in different ways. And then they're appealing to tradition, but the question is what part of tradition and where do we take the tradition? So all those pieces. And then reason. If I think this, then what does that imply as well? So there's that. I should also say I'm not a Wesleyan, I'm a Presbyterian. So
right.
Any things that I didn't get right, I fully claim there.
I have to have that caveat out there all the time because although I was raised as a Methodist, as United Methodist, I identify as Episcopalian as an adult. So I always have to, how much do I remember probably? And anyway, so yeah, etc. I did as I promised a few weeks back, by the way, where I ventured into having opinions about things United Methodist, and promised I would go talk to my colleagues across the hall who actually know what they're talking about in that regard, and I really did, and I learned quite a bit from it. We're pretty close to time, and it's just the two of us, and we've been going on for quite a while, so we can probably let folks go. Sarah, I didn't ask you to prepare this. This is not a prepared question. Anything that you like about, that you'd want to get across to your learners about Jeremiah, like anything that when 2 or 3 months have gone by and they've forgotten all their facts about Jeremiah and can't remember where he came in the historical, where he, and all this kind of stuff. Is there anything you want them to be walking around with on Jeremiah that might sort of compel them to go back to Jeremiah, both his pages and the pages about him in the textbooks and so on?
Yeah, that's a great question. And then off the cuff, I think I would return to what I started with, is just how honest Jeremiah is with God. And he's certainly not the only example. I mean, lament Psalms. There's plenty of those in Job, and we've got these lots of characters in the Hebrew Bible who are so raw and honest with God. But I just think that's something that's gives permission to say, yeah, you can complain. As you wrote on the OOTLE15 page, you can say to God, liar, liar, pants on fire. And it's okay. You're not going to be smote with lightning and destroyed, because there's a sense of, if it is about, as you described earlier, being in some sort of a relationship with God, then there should be some honesty in that. So I always return to that. And I think Jeremiah is, for me, a great exemplar of that.
That's good. What would I do? I think what I would do now, my answer would be different now than it was before our episode today, is if there's some part of the Hebrew Bible that you just don't care about, then find a peer to talk to about that material. And don't even try to fake it. Just start explaining to them everything you don't like about that material. And there's a very good chance that by the time you're done with the conversation, you'll decide that you're really excited about that material. Because I'm very excited about Jeremiah now, and I'm especially excited about Jeremiah. I have thought about this before as someone who is hashing out in a very difficult way, and in a way that breeds conflict. Real conflict, as we see in the narratives about Jeremiah. About community. Community always sounds like such a unicorns and pixie dust kind of word, but community is what's happening between Jeremiah and his opponents in trying to hash out their claims about God. Who is God? What does God want? How does God work in the world? How doesn't God work in the world? What does God want or not want? What are our convictions around that? what is for them, what is Yahwism, and hashing that out together. And it's I just find that it's a compelling image that I have now of Jeremiah that I didn't really have an hour ago. So okay, good. Well,
So success then.
success, mission
Yeah.
accomplished.
Well, and my other response too is that's the text writ large where you've got conversation going on. So it would fit that in a conversation you can learn more about these texts which are constantly in conversation with one another.
Mm-hmm. Knowledge is not some. This is pure. If you want to look into this, look into connectivism or connectivist learning. Right? It's an example. This is for me is an example of, knowledge is not something that is locked or hidden away somewhere and that needs to be disseminated to learners. Knowledge is something that knowledge is something that is constructed on networks, in the interactions between nodes on that network. For example, people in a conversation, right? That's where knowledge is constructed. So if there's something you want to know about, network with others and begin constructing that knowledge, and not simply seeking out the hidden places where it resides, so that it can be disseminated to you. So. All right, Sarah, thank you so much. I didn't mention at the beginning, we're doing this hangout at a ridiculous hour of the day. We normally go in the afternoons, and we went with 9 o'clock Central Time this morning, which for you West Coast people, Sarah, is 7 to 8 in the morning?
It is 7 to 8, and I have to say I've been especially whiny this week about daylight savings time, which is a whole other topic, because I don't think I've quite adjusted yet, which is really ridiculous.
It's the worst.
No, happy to have this to get up for, and a good start to the day.
I owe you so big. All right. Well, thanks again. And next week we'll be back on our regular time, which is 3 o'clock Central Time, Thursday of next week. We might have one other week that's good. I think the week after that. We got another week coming up at some point that's at some weird time, I think the 26th or so. So I'll keep people informed about that. Thank you very much. Again, this was Sarah Koenig, Assistant Professor, Associate, congratulations, Sarah. Associate Professor of Biblical Studies at Seattle Pacific University in Seattle, Washington, and the author of Isn't This Bathsheba? A Study in Characterization. And Sarah also writes at workingpreacher.org. And you can find my stuff at brookelester.net, B-R-O-O-K-E, lester.net. And I also blog at seminariumblog.org. And I'm a Numa Brook on Twitter. All right. Thanks again, Sarah, and I'll look forward to us the next time that you're able to come around for this. All right. Oop. There you go. Okay.
All right. Thanks. Bye.
Bye, Sarah. Thanks. Bye, everybody.